Okay, so here we go. Oh, shoot. I got to reset my PowerPoint. Looks like now I'm going to have to edit the video. Okay.
Hi, Sandy.
Now, how do I get this off my screen, Brian? It says that it's a
Click
big
OK.
thing on my screen. Just hit got it.
Yeah, one second.
Just hit got it.
Okay, I'm back. Okay.
Cool. All right. So we have Leviticus.
Leviticus.
Gotta shrink this. So Leviticus, for this presentation, we're going to be pulling again from the Old Testament, 4th edition by Coogan and Cynthia Chapman. If you want to, I think, Sandy, this is your first time joining. I've been highlighting that the Old Testament, 4th edition, is very much an academic textbook, but they've come out with a brief introduction to the Old Testament, which is the picture you see there on the screen, and that's kind of designed for everybody to look at, whereas the textbook is more, if you're taking a college course or something. And then also the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary. So our roadmap for tonight, Fun in the Iron Age, or our Leviticus breakdown. Go through why, who, and how was Leviticus made. And then we're kind of breaking it down this way. I'm following Coogan's breakdown in the book. Leviticus 1 through 7, instructions on sacrifice, or God and barbecue. 8 through 10, consecration of the tabernacle, or pomp and circumstance. 11 through 15, instructions on purity and impurity, or health and ritual. Leviticus 16, instructions on atonement, or the high holy day. And then Leviticus 17 through 26, the Holiness Codes, or the Israelite Revised Code. We're going to do a little breakout on Leviticus 24, 10 through 23, equality under the law, or God's the big shot, not you. And then Leviticus 27, real briefly, vows, or bribing the big G. So, who all wrote Leviticus? Oh, Leviticus, and much of the Bible as we have it, is the work of many, many different people. Most scholars say the final editors were Judean Israelites living during the Babylonian exile in Babylon or shortly after the return. They were pulling together from all different kinds of sources and traditions, written, oral, and weaving together the story and traditions of their people. And Genesis, Exodus, Numbers were kind of the 4 major ones that came out of this. Deuteronomy maybe a little later. But while obviously Genesis and Exodus and Numbers is very much narrative driven, Leviticus is very much a legal code. Actually, a couple different legal codes. Recently, a growing number of scholars, though, say that the final editors were Second Temple Israelites living during the Persian period, i.e., when they come back from exile and the temple is beginning to be built again, is when Leviticus and the rest of the Torah was finalized, according to recent scholarship. So why was Leviticus made? It was made so that there were rules and regulation to give order to cultic and communal life. They wrote down various traditions and rituals to preserve their identity during the exile and to reestablish it once they returned. So again, the focus here, the overriding urge to create this was preservation. Which is why when sources contradict each other, they preserve both. Why? If you're not sure how to please God, cover all your bases. So you have 2 old traditions that have very strong provenance. Are you going to pick and choose? What if you pick the wrong one? So copy them both down. And it's something I think a lot of people forget about. A lot of Leviticus, the majority of the material is about relationships within the community than about the relationship with God, the relationship between a person and God. So, how was it made? Again, different sources from over many centuries were edited together. Well, the Holiness Code, that one huge chunk of Leviticus in the breakdown, represents one source that was largely preserved. And then later, other sources in Leviticus, represents one source largely preserved that is also later than the other sources or other ritual codes in the Torah. So Leviticus has certain sources, and then you have the covenant in Exodus, you have the Deuteronomic Code. The Holiness Code, they think, is later than any of those. And also, again, the Holiness Code contradicts these other sources at times because the overriding is to preserve, not to make it, not to have continuity within, but to preserve the tradition. Most scholars say the first draft of what we have came from Judean Israelites living during the Babylonian exile in Babylon, or the return shortly thereafter. Again, a number say that the final editors were during the Second Temple or the Persian period. A lot of the argument for those first scholars, though, for the Babylonian exile or the return, is a lot of the language, particularly in the Holiness Code, is similar to the book of Ezekiel. And we know Ezekiel is from the exile. So since there's that similar language, you can place them together with confidence. So our first chunk of Leviticus, 1 through 7, instructions on sacrifice or God and barbecue. It goes through, I'm not going to go through the litany of different things here. Again, we're just doing kind of a general overview. So it talks about sacrifices. Different sacrifices are prescribed for different reasons. But they all play on the idea of repairing relationship through a common meal. So when a person would go to the temple, later when there was the temple, or earlier when they go to the mountaintop and offer their sacrifice to God, it was participating in a meal with God. Either you did this for forgiveness, for thanksgiving, or petition. How it functioned within the community, in other words, the more practical effects that were felt on the ground from the system of sacrifice, was this is how the priesthood was fed and maintained. Food from the sacrifices and offerings that were prescribed, especially the grain ones, were stored in case times of famine and for the needy. And then later, the sacrifice system, when the monarchy came around, was also how taxation occurred and also became the power base for the nobility, because the nobility begins to take over the priesthood and assumes control of those food stores. Sacrifices and offerings, as it gets through all this, it covers the whole range of what's, hows, and sometimes whys. So, you offer the bull for this reason, you offer the goats for this reason. If you don't have a goats, get a dove, how you do it. And then it doesn't always tell you why. Like, for instance, it describes a whole burnt offering, but it doesn't really tell you why you would do that. Leviticus 8 through 10 is the story of the consecration of the tabernacle. So, or pomp and circumstance. This is one of the few really only two narrative breaks in just the laundry list of rituals and regulations. So chapter 8 through 9 picks up right where the Exodus story leaves off. So the Exodus story ends with Moses building the tabernacle and the tabernacle being consecrated. Now the priests are ordained over 8 days as God commanded. It's begun by Moses, but then taken over by Aaron. Why? Because Aaron is the head of the priesthood. You know, God said the priesthood will flow through Aaron. But Moses is the bigger deal. So you have Moses takes over. Moses is the one who sanctifies Aaron, and then Aaron takes over and sanctifies the rest of the priesthood. It's also the narrative of the first sacrifice that is offered to God, and God gives God's approval. Chapter 10 is the story of why priests can't get tanked before a ritual, because it didn't go well that one time it happened. Some naughty young priests apparently had some fun right before they were supposed to offer a sacrifice and screwed it up, and it didn't go well. God got a little annoyed and pushed the smoke button. So, on that note, understanding the ancient mindset. This seems like a good place to do that with all of the smiting. You know, as we get into this, once again, we have to remember we're dealing with a very different world, really. One of the things that we have to really understand is there is no concept of religious and secular. You know, we have this modern idea of religion and then a secular world where religion is shut off from or doesn't engage. Okay? That doesn't exist for really the majority of human history. In all cultures, especially in the Mediterranean world, during the biblical period, the whole biblical period, and for much after, the divine is present in all aspects of life. Okay? This is why Israelite monotheism becomes such a problem for daily life for Israelites and Jews living outside of predominant Israelite culture. When they go outside Judah or Israel into the wider world, or as they're getting conquered and moving about, because the theocratic worldview means all laws and all life, cultic or civic, so those pertaining to dealing with the God, what we would call religious life or civic life, are related to the divine. And even just daily life, like, you know, in the Roman world, you had the god for blacksmiths, and all blacksmiths, when they made deals, they'd offer a sacrifice to the god. Well, if you're a Jew, that's a problem. So again, that goes back to that first point. The second point also pertains to what we're about to read in Leviticus, this cultic or civic. Again, there's no religious, there's no secular. So that's kind of why I use the word cultic or civic. Cultic referring to the things that have to do with life around the temple, things that are specifically around dealing with God and just God, versus civic, which are, you know, again, the revised code, life with each other. You know, what laws, how do we govern relationships? You know, no stealing from one another. You know, we talk about that in church usually as a moral, right? Because it's a religious ideal. That's not Leviticus's worldview. When Leviticus says, thou shalt not steal, it's a legal code, right? It's the Israelite revised code. So even though in our mindset, there's this religious guide and there's the Ohio Revised Code, for Leviticus, it's all the same. And like modern laws, they are in part to restrain violence. And there are no mandatory minimums, only the maximum sentence is given. So, you know, a lot of the times Leviticus gets beaten up because, you know, it seems like every other thing somebody's getting the death penalty for. Well, that's the maximum under the law. That doesn't mean when someone was brought before the elders or the priests or the whoever, that that was what would happen. The other thing we need to deal with when we encounter the Hebrew Bible, and especially Leviticus and Deuteronomy, is purity and impurity, holiness, are not sinless and sin. They're not synonyms. Okay? Most translations use clean and unclean. Coogan says, you know, that can get into ideas of hygiene and you know, dirt and things. It's not about that. Purity and impurity. Purity status relates to fitness for civic and cultic life. Okay, it's about your ability to be a part of God's community. Cultic life, participation in the cultic ceremonies, the things that are happening at the temple, other ceremonies revolving around God and God's interaction with people. Civic life, the rituals and customs Israel uses to set it apart from its neighbors and its laws. Sin makes one impure, but impurity is not sin. What I mean by that is things that are sinful are things that rupture relationship. Therefore, your purity, your fitness to be a part of what is happening in relationship with God and therefore with each other, is made impure. Okay? But what Leviticus says is impurity is not sin. To put it one way, stealing from someone is a sin, right? That would also make you impure. Getting a cut on your finger and blood comes out will make you impure, according to Leviticus, but that is not a sin. So it's not just about morality, it's about a state of being fit before God. And we'll get into this a little more with the Holiness Code. Before we go any farther, any questions? Because we've just done a bunch of stuff. Anybody? Okay. So, Leviticus 11 through 15. Instructions on purity and impurity, or health and ritual. So the Holiness Code is a huge thing that kind of goes along the same thing. Leviticus 11 through 15 is a different source that hits a lot of the same points, just doesn't go into as much depth. But why purity and impurity? Why do some things have the status and some don't? Well, there doesn't seem to be a consistent reason. Several factors seem to be at play, which is why it can seem so confusing for a modern person to just read the thing. One, something that is pure seems to be something that is less chance of making you sick. Eating something that is impure seems to be things that increase the chance of food poisoning. So, for instance, no shellfish. Why? Well, anybody ever had bad shellfish? Obviously, that's God showing his displeasure at you eating it. Also, you don't eat animals that eat dead things, in part because they carry disease. So don't eat them. The second thing that seems to be in play, and I will say also, sometimes these three things or four things overlap. The second thing, a big, huge one that also plays into all the codes. Well, I mean, the whole Torah. Cultural identity. Okay, keeping a distinct and separate people. Okay, we are distinct and separate people. We are the people God has called us to be. We're chosen people, and we need to act different and better. So we're not going to eat pigs like those Philistines up there. They're gross. They eat pigs, so we're not eating pigs. We're not doing polyblend either. You only get to wear fibers made of, or fabric made of one fiber. So anybody wearing polyblend, I'm sorry, you're committing an abomination against God. So in other words, so again, it's creating a unique identity for unique people. A third thing that seems to be at play is a sense of order, ordering life. God has ordered the cosmos, so we must order our lives. You know, we must order everything so that it makes sense and has some shape to it. You know, there's a rule in there, 2 different animals can't pull a plow. Why? Because God has ordered the cosmos. Some things are for some things. You know, if you're going to use a donkey, use a donkey. If you're going to use an ox, use an ox. Don't use both. That's just, it's disordered. We need to be ordered and orderly. And the big thing above all is relationship to life. Life is sacred. And rituals and regulations revolve around what is sacred. Therefore, anything related to life, or that is life-giving, involves some type of purity status. For instance, all those regulations around sex, especially semen, that's because how life is made. Sex ed in the ancient world, the man implants the seed, the woman is the vessel, the seed transforms into a little human that grows and grows. So we're not so worried about the vessel, we're worried about the seed, and we don't want to waste it or spill it because it's limited. Sex is God's first command, so it's important, but because you're doing something that relates to it, that relates to life, it makes you impure. So again, doing things that make you impure isn't necessarily, it's not, Leviticus isn't saying it's necessarily a sin. Sex is not a sin in Leviticus in and of itself, but it makes you impure. Regulations around blood and blood loss are a big thing because blood contains life. Menstruation makes a woman impure because it involves blood loss. Again, not because of some inherent sinful whatever. Anything revolving blood, it's impure. You can't go to the temple. You got to chill for at least a day, a couple days, and then do some kind of ritual. Death is the opposite of life. So coming in contact with anything dead makes you really impure. All right, there's a regulation, the high priest, the one who goes into the holiest of holies, he can't be around a corpse at all. If his wife dies, he ain't going to the funeral.
Nice.
In fact, his entire family can't be around a dead body. His brother dies, they ain't going. And again, most forms of impurity have a time period and a ritual so that you regain your pure status. Because it's not a standing of moral self or inherent goodness or anything like that in and of itself. It's about your status to be participating in these rituals with God. So Leviticus 16 is instructions on the Day of Atonement, or the High Holy Day. A side note, Coogan points out that the Day of Atonement was not the High Holy Day it is now in Judaism, but it was still big enough that it gets a heck of a lot of regulations in Leviticus. The High Holy Day, biblically, was the ritual day when the priest, the sanctuary, and all the people were purified. So everybody gets their big purification. It was called the Sabbath of Sabbath. So on this day, everything stops. You don't go to work. You go to temple, you go to mountaintop, you do your thing for the High Holy Day, but that's it. There's no plowing, there's no business, no commerce, there's no eating until sundown, and there's no sex. There were two types of sacrifices offered on this day. One was a bull as a sin offering. 2 goats were sacrificed. They cast lots. One was offered to Yahweh, the other was the scapegoat, which they would perform a ritual where all the sins of the people were put onto the scapegoat and it ran off into the wilderness, carrying all the people's sins away. I point that out because if that sounds kind of like some theology you might have heard around Easter, this is where it's coming from. So any questions on any of that?
Oh, God.
Or comments? Any point of clarification needed?
I'll check with you a little bit later on some spelling, that's all.
Oh, I guarantee no spelling is correct. Absolutely none. Never, never, ever.
Okay. I know that it's not, well, anyway. Okay.
So here we get into the Holiness Codes. And this is, as you can see, kind of the bulk of Leviticus. The Holiness Codes, 90% of what we went over with the Purity Codes applies. So again, there are things we talk about as sin, i.e. moral failings that impact holiness, but being unholy or not holy is not necessarily reflective of sin. And as we get into that, hopefully it'll make sense. The Holiness Code, again, is an independent source used to make Leviticus. What does that mean? It means when the editors were sitting around in the exile or shortly thereafter, and they're pulling all these traditions together, the Holiness Code is one book that they say, okay, we're just popping this thing in here, more or less. So there's not the stitching together that you see in other places. It's a pretty concise work. However, that said, it does have its own sources, internal contradictions, and idiosyncrasies. Again, contradictions because we're preserving tradition, come hell or high water. Also, again, the Holiness Code originates just before or during the exile. So what is holiness? Right? It's a little different from purity. They're cousins. They're related, but not quite. The Hebrew word for holiness, the root word, is separation. So in other words, holiness is about creating separation from the profane, the impure, and the ordinary. And how they achieve holiness is by creating separations between people, different people groups, spaces, and time. This is in the book. I'm a visual person, so I think this drives it home easier. In the top, if you think of the very center of all these circles as the most holy, okay, at the top you have persons. So at the very center, there's God, Yahweh. He's the most holy. So the closest circle to him, the closer you are to him, the holier you are. The more special to God, the greater access you have to God. So right after Yahweh is the chief priest. He's the one who on the Day of Atonement gets to enter the Holy of Holies and be in God's presence. Then you have the rest of the priests, the Levites, all the Israelites, and then all the other nations. So God is the God of everyone. So they're allowed to participate, but they can't get too close. If you look down at spaces, how do you create holiness in a space? Well, you have the Holy of Holies that contains the literal presence of God, where the Ark of the Covenant sits there as God's footstool. Okay. Then outside that, you have the sanctuary. Then you have the courtyard of the tabernacle and the temple, or the camp, or the land of Israel, depending on the courtyard of the tabernacle would have been before the temple was built, or the temple once it's built. The camp was when they had the tabernacle and they're moving it around all over the place. Once they build the temple, it's the land of Israel or the land of Judah later on. And then other lands, because God's the God of everywhere, but those other lands aren't as holy. Because God has chosen this land, God has chosen these people. Right? In order for something to be holy, it has to be ordered and living according to God. And then times, you have the Sabbath, it's the most holy, other holy days, and then other days. Does that make sense in terms of what's holiest and what holiness is? It's closeness to God. Okay, and then we have something else. The Holiness Codes contain all the sexual prohibitions. Like, you can't sleep with your sister, you can't sleep with your granddaughter, you can't sleep with your cousin, you can't sleep with this family relation. It also has 2 verses that are used as, they're called the clobber passages by anti-gay Christians. I wanted to deal with that real quick. So a lot of our translations have some variation on man shall not lie with a man. Well, context matters in everything, especially Leviticus. These are laid out in order. Right? One of the reasons they did this was to create order in their world. God is the God who comes and brings order. That's the first creation story. He orders the cosmos. So if your God is the God of order, life needs to have order. And the law will be ordered as well. So these things are chunked together very specifically. And the context of both chapter 18 and 20, both of which contain this sentence, man shall not lie with a man, are given the context of making sure the people are not like the Canaanites or the Egyptians. So a whole bunch, especially these sexual regulations, pertain around that. Both of these groups, Canaanites and Egyptians, regularly held orgies and had temple prostitutes, both male and female, as a part of worship or temple cultic activities. So what it's talking about is not about same-sex relationships or being in love with someone of the same sex or gender, or even having sex with another person of the same gender. The focus here is about what is proper worship, and what is not proper worship is engaging in any kind of sexual activity while you're in the presence of God, or to the presence of God, or engaging in that activity for any other gods. And we went over this at the Affirming Scripture study, and somebody definitely raised their hand and was like, wait a minute, I'm having trouble wrapping my head around this temple prostitute thing. And it's very off the wall, in part because Leviticus has made it that way in our culture. But regularly in other cultures outside, the Romans had it too. To honor the god or goddess, you would have sex with a prostitute or priest. This is a prohibition against that.
And the temple, the use of temple was not the Israel's temple. I mean, make that distinction that there were other temples.
That's clear. Yeah, good point. Good call. Yeah, the Israelites did not have temple. Well, Yahweh did not have temple prostitutes. This was other deities and other cultures. And again, it's within the context of Canaanite and Egyptian. You will not be like the Canaanites. You will not do X, Y, Z. So again, it cuts to, remember when I went through the different reasons behind these. One was life is sacred, reproduction is sacred, and we're doing things differently than those other people around us because we're special people. Those regulations hit all three.
And was there not, at least one of the things I had learned in this kind of study is that because the Israelite population did not match in numbers the larger communities around them, Canaanites, Egyptians, etc., so that there was a very practical concern about wasting semen that would not produce more people.
Yep.
So that was part of the practicality of the Holiness Code.
Yeah. Like I said, the very first commandment God gives in Genesis is go forth and multiply, which cuts to that as well.
So, Brian, back to Leviticus 18, man shall not sleep with man.
Uh-huh.
I was under the impression that there was a different translation for that and meaning for that. That it was more man shall not sleep or lay with boys.
That is also, if I'm remembering correctly, I know that's in Romans when Paul lays that out. The word Paul uses that a lot of translations label as homosexual is young men. And I think in the Greek, it mentions that too. In the Greek translation of the Hebrew of Leviticus, which is also possible because you did have in the Greco-Roman world ritualized pederasty, where like a mentor would sleep with their protege.
Mhm.
Yeah. But what came up when I was looking it up earlier with this, because I wanted to double check that, because I know in Paul it's that. Paul specifically in like Romans calls that out. But what I was looking at today, it was mostly within the context of the temple prostitutes. And the answer is it could be a catch-all for all that.
Mhm.
The article I was reading today mostly pointed out because the context that this line is specifically given is the Canaanites and Egyptians. The pederasty thing was Greco-Roman.
Well, I was kind of impressed with that because of Martin Luther's translation, where he definitely, being a priest himself,
Mm-hmm.
translated from the Greek, that
Mm-hmm.
he was interpreting that more as a man laying down with a young boy, or
Yeah. Well, and again, the one I was looking at was talking about the Hebrew. When they translated the Hebrew into the Greek, the Septuagint, they could have used the young boy thing, in which case it would be speaking to that.
okay.
Either because that's the original meaning or because they broadened it out to that when they were translating it. But
Okay.
again, I mean, at the end of the day,
Context.
at the end of the day, what is it not about? It's not about two people who are in love or who's attracted to who. It's about anything but.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So Leviticus 24, 10 through 23 is the other short little narrative breakout we have of equality under the law, or God's the big shot, not you. So what's the purpose here? Chapter 24 is a story that reinforces the idea everyone is equal under the law, the civic law. So, because again, it's this weird thing where cultic law, we saw it with the holiness, right? Like non-Israelites aren't allowed as close to the tabernacle or the temple as Israelites. But when you're out and about in society, everybody's under the same law. And that's what this story highlights. It's the story of a man of mixed Egyptian Israelite birth. He gets in a fight with a full Israelite. And then the Egyptian Israelite, blasphemies, which is against the law. He's taken to Moses and held. God speaks to Moses and says the man is to be stoned for blasphemy under the law. And God then gives a monologue reaffirming that the punishment must fit the crime, and there is only one law for all people, citizens and non-citizens. In other words, this guy couldn't get out of it by saying, well, I'm not a full Israelite, I'm not under the law. No, everybody, the law is the law when you're out and about in the world. Which gets us to progressive Leviticus. What? Leviticus, as I've said, has gotten lots of bad press, deservingly, over its various reasons. It's retributive justice, eye for an eye, patriarchy, bigotry, sometimes, or at least that's what it's used to justify, i.e. with people using the clobber passages. And it's straight up over and flat out use of capital punishment, sometimes regardless of the context. The context for Leviticus is this is an Iron Age text, again, born of a world very different from ours. We can't simply read the pages and act as if they apply to our world. You know, does anybody really think that somebody who blasphemies should be stoned to death? I don't. Does anyone think that somebody who steals something should get their hand cut off? No. The reality, though, is much of the Hebrew Bible in the New Testament does exactly this. It doesn't simply read the pages and act as if they just apply. Right? Much of the Hebrew Bible in the New Testament is saying, no, you shouldn't cut somebody's hand off just because they steal. That's the maximum sentence. You shouldn't do the maximum. Again, like I said earlier, Leviticus doesn't give mandatory minimums. It gives the maximum sentence. It's about constraining violence. Eye for an eye is one of those things that gets a bad rap, but in the context of the world it's in, is actually quite progressive. Because before eye for an eye, if Sue bumps into me in the hallway, I can cut her head off.
God.
But under eye for an eye, all I can do is give her a little bump back.
Or take an eye.
Huh?
Literally, I think, was it not the case? If somebody pokes your eye out,
Mm-hmm.
A family might gather and go and kill the person. But under this law, you could only take their eye out.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. It's limiting the violence that, it's this idea, it's this Iron Age articulation of the idea that the punishment must fit the crime. You can't go above and beyond what makes sense in this Iron Age context. Much of the underlying theology and ethics of Leviticus points towards Israel as a progressive nation within its Iron Age context. Again, the idea of eye for an eye and restraining violence is something I think that is eternal. Restraining violence, that punishment must fit the crime. You can't have excessive punishment. If somebody does something to you, you can't go out there and burn their house down. However, there are exceptions to every rule, and there are exceptions to the previous rule. There are several passages and ideas that are still concepts the modern world could use without any real intense study of history or culture. Do not hold back the hired wages of a hired worker overnight. Do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind. But fear your God, I am the Lord. No making fun of the handicapped people. Don't pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. Again, equality before the law. Food stamps. That wasn't something that came out in modern day America. That was from the Iron Age of Israel. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pluck up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. Note that, poor and the foreigner. When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people. but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. That greatest commandment, straight out of Leviticus. And then there's chapter 25, economic justice. As some of you had to pay student loans, let me tell you, I love this one. The Jubilee year, every 50th year, beginning with the Day of Atonement, was a Jubilee year. All Israelite slaves were set freed and went back to their families. All farm land was returned to its ancestral owners. The land must not be sold permanently because the land is mine, and you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. In other words, the land is God's. You can't sell God's gift. God will let you lease it out to somebody, but you can't outright sell it. And there's whole sections dealing with how the land is returned to people. If somebody's too poor to buy it back or maintain it, then there's whole regulations about, next man up. No predatory banking. If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and are unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a foreigner and a stranger, so that they can continue to live among you. Do not take interest or any profit from them, but fear your God, so that they may continue to live among you. You must not lend them money at interest, and this, I had forgotten this, I didn't know it was there, or sell them food at a profit. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. So, when we talk about social justice in the church, it's not just the prophets, it's the very law of Israel. And this is extremely important. And honestly, especially this part, the all farmland returns to its ancestral owners. There's a part about if it's a walled city and somebody sells a house, then the family can, come back and buy it back within a year. But after that, it's the person who bought it. Land outside a walled city, the agricultural land, the land that would have been owned by the poor, the underclasses, where if you take the land from them, you're taking away their livelihood, that land gets returned. So again, this, Israelite society, it's story of Exodus. We talked about last week how Exodus is the narrative. We were slaves in Egypt. We were the underclass. And we are coming to create a classless society. Right? We talked about how the covenant in Exodus is the people taking God as their king, as their ruler. So all the people are equal. And again, you can't sell food at a profit. Again, being very class conscious. All right, vows or bribing the big G is chapter 27. Chapter 26, I didn't make a slide for this, is a whole lot of blessings and curses. It's kind of the standard format if you're making a treaty between anybody, really, like between two kings or between a king and a people. And chapter 26 is just that. Coogan points out and Chapman point out how it's kind of prophecy, what did they call it? Essentially, they're saying it's retroactive prophecy in that, it's written in the exile. So they're writing from that perspective. They're writing this for the return when they're going to renew this covenant. So they're laying out, essentially saying this is what happened. You know, if we keep the vows, we'll be able to stay. But when we didn't keep the vows, this is what happened. So now when we renew this thing, we know what's going to happen. And then chapter 27 in some ways is a bit of a letdown because you have this very big epic language of, you know, everything's going to fall apart, but I'll restore you if you come back and honor all this. So it's the big arc of things will be good. If you break it, things will be bad. But the promise of restoration, which is exactly what they needed to hear. Chapter 27 then are vows, or like I said, bribing, the big G. Chapter 27 is like optional offerings. It's almost like an addendum. So if you think of, especially the Holiness Code, as this kind of legal agreement between God and the people, and then it has this ending of blessing and curses. The reason you have these vows, these optional offerings after the blessings and curses, is because they're optional, right? God's not going to hold it against you if you don't do these things. But they still have to be ordered. So it governs what you can give. Like if you give your house, this is how you do it. These are the consequences. If you want to, that was out of order. For example, you can dedicate a child to temple service. That's what happened to Samuel, the prophet Samuel. His mother was childless. She prays to God, I will give him as a Nazarene to your service. She donates him to the, essentially dedicates him, donates him to become part of the tabernacle support system. They become servants at the tabernacle, not slaves, but servants. They essentially, their job would be as not part of the priesthood, but like a second class to the priesthood. Or you can donate part of your land to God, i.e. to the temple, to supporting the priesthood, the cult. But for instance, you can't donate your tithe or a firstborn animal because those are already God's. The tithe was the 10% of, first 10% of your grain or your offering. That's what went to God by right and to the priesthood. A firstborn animal was sacrificed to God. So those are already God's. You can't count those as an offering for when you make a vow. And that is Leviticus. And, every time I start these, I think, oh, this one will be shorter and we'll have more time. And now it's 8. Any questions, comments, thoughts to share?
Quick summary.
Exactly.
I know. Well, I mean, it's like, it's doing these info dumps. It reminds me of grad school when we had Intro to Scripture as one class, not even like Intro to Old Testament or New Testament, but the whole shebang. It's like you fly through at breakneck speed, going 90 miles an hour. So Leviticus, I know,
get some of that background too.
Yeah. And like I said, the real point of these isn't to like make you know everything or to retain every little bit, but just to help, kind of give some confidence and have it all swim in the back of your head when you go to read it. Because, a lot of these texts and the stories and, like Leviticus, can be intimidating because we don't quite get it, or it sounds very off-putting, but hopefully kind of in hearing all this, not even necessarily, like I said, retaining every little bit, but just getting those ideas floating around in our heads can help kind of tackle it and at least give mindset we kind of need to find that divine, find God breathing through these moldy old holiness codes. So, because part of the reason I went through the progressive thing was that there is stuff that even today you can look at, read the black and white and go, yep, that's good. People should get paid for their work. And especially, looking a lot of these within the context of the Iron Age and the world around them, the treating the poor with respect. You can't charge food at a profit. I know the slavery system, it seems so, slavery's barbaric. But when you place Israel's slavery system within the context of the wider world, if you mistreated your slaves, it says if you beat one and its tooth falls out, they're free. So in the legal code, they're property, but you can't treat them like property. So you see this progression happening. The narrative of the Bible is one of progress, of drawing closer and closer to that idea of holiness. So that's it. Everybody can unbuckle your seatbelts.
Well, thank you, Brian.
Yes, thank you.
No worries.
Yes.
So next week, even more fascinating stuff. The Book of Numbers.
Yeah.
More than just a bunch of begots. So we get back into some narrative.
Is it next week? I thought it was
Week
other-
after. Pardon me. Week after.
Week after. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and yeah, if you look over Leviticus and something new pops up, be sure and we'll share it next week.
Okay.
All right. All right. Have a good night, everybody.
All right.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.